Hi, my name is Mark Crawley and welcome to Diversita Connect. Today we're going to talk about disclosure, and what we're going to talk a little bit about are the risks associated with disclosure, have a look at some statistics, but also show what we consider quite an indicative pathway for a lot of neurodivergent employees if they haven't felt safe to disclose, either interview stage, job application stage, or when they've started a role. So it's quite an interesting subject because, of course, you don't have to disclose as a neurodivergent individual in the UK. There's no legal obligation for you to talk about your neurotype and be open around certain aspects there if you're not comfortable. But it can be a real positive in a lot of working environments, but equally so, it can also be a bit of a challenge. So we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail now. So essentially, first of all, just to start, is what is disclosure, right? So for those who are watching this on YouTube or on Diversita Connect or listening on the podcast, we're just going to summarize this in a bit more detail now. So we're not going to use too many graphics today. There's a few in there, but of course we want to make this as accessible as for everyone if they're listening to this on a podcast as well. So disclosure effectively refers to the act of voluntarily sharing your information about your neurotype with others. This can be in a workplace, educational setting, or social situation, but it's very much a personal decision with no right or wrong answer. It's so up to the individual to weigh the potential benefits and risks here. And we're going to cover those in a little bit more detail in a second. But what's worth noting, again, and I will labour this fact throughout, is that it's very much your decision. It really is. We've got other webinars like identifying neuro-inclusive companies and self-advocacy and disability committed employers that may help or influence your decision to disclose. We've got other ones around, is your manager neuro-inclusive? Again, looking for some telltale signs to make you feel a bit more comfortable when disclosing. But ultimately, it is your decision. So there's a few statistics here. I have a very, very new report from the City Guilds, which is the Neurodiversity Index of 2026. So some of the stats that have come out on this, and it's a really good report actually, with some really good granular level detail, is that a very high percentage of neurodivergent employees feel they cannot disclose their neurotype at job application, often leading to post-hire disclosure. So it's almost like you've gone through a bit of a recruitment process, you didn't feel comfortable disclosing, and now you're making a decision as to whether to disclose in your organization. And we're going to talk about something called almost like an underperformance pathway in a second, and I'll give you some reasons as to why. There is a very, very poor response, it seems. So 10% of employees reported a poor response from employees after disclosing. So imagine that, right? You've summoned up the courage and the confidence to disclose. You've probably done a bit of a risk analysis around this, and then you've got sort of a pretty reasonably high percentage of receiving quite a poor response. Nearly 1 in 3 neurodivergent employees are dissatisfied with the support they receive from employers. So even when you do get some type of adjustment or some type of support after disclosing, about a third are saying they're not happy with what they've got, and workplace adjustments. So despite disclosure, again, and nearly a third of employees report having no adjustments made to support them. So there's again, you can see here, there's a group that aren't really disclosing. There's a group that are disclosing and then receiving quite a mixed bag in terms of support afterwards. But I think the part there that really sort of, I suppose, gets under my skin a little bit is that you've gone through something where you're like, you know what, I really feel I can trust my employer in this instance. And then you do it, and then you receive either a negative response or not the type of support that you may need. But there is also something else which isn't really mentioned on this report, where you have what we call a sort of a knock-on effect of non-disclosure or neurodivergent job seekers and employees not feeling safe to disclose, and how that can impact your career pathway and employment pathway. But we'll cover that in a second. Something else to look at really is the benefits, right? So we don't want anyone to feel that disclosure is something that doesn't have any benefits or can't be a real positive, because it really can be. Because if you find an employer that you feel comfortable to disclose to, you can receive some great support. You really can. You can receive accommodations, understanding from others. You can promote acceptance, reduce stigma, be a bit of a trailblazer for your organization, and show a really clear pathway for other neurodivergent employees. But of course, there's so much potential for discrimination, negative stereotypes, and misunderstanding. But also, I think sometimes there's a bit of a dismissive approach from some organizations and managers, where, because they don't really understand it, and some people may almost sort of roll their eyes and think, oh, another person talking about ADHD here, etc. You don't really get, I would say, any level of reaction. There's almost a bit of apathy around the disclosure. So it is important to, and we will say this to organizations, to provide some level of response and some level of process within that. But we'll cover a few things that you can look out for before you disclose, particularly if you're disclosing post-job application or post-role, as in you've got the role without disclosing, you started a job, and now you want to look at how you disclose after that. But it's something I really wanted to cover today, because I do training for a lot of organizations, and I've had a few instances relatively recently, as in the last year or so, where we've had a few hiring managers and people managers who, to be fair, are probably feel a little bit confused or a little bit sort of on the fence around how to handle disclosure, particularly when it's at sort of almost a performance review stage, right? And what I mean by that is someone is underperforming in their role, gets to that point, and then they disclose, right? And what a manager will probably see there is like, well, this is an excuse, right? You're disclosing now because you're underperforming. Whereas I have a very, very different view on it after talking to a lot of our community. And we're just going to go through that now. And we're going to show, I suppose, in this instance, probably the benefit for organizations to create environments where people can disclose, and of course the benefit for the employee. So just to illustrate this point, I'm probably making quite badly, but we'll get onto it a little bit more now. So what I'm going to show is a few examples. So for example, if you don't feel comfortable as a neurodivergent job seeker to disclose a job application, there are a few reasons as to why you won't. It might be there's no clear way to ask for adjustments or disclose on the application stage, no real mention of neuro-inclusion on the careers part, no really reassurance in any of the literature or any of the guidance or application that adjustment requests are welcome, and no suggested adjustments. And there's a lot of subjective requirements in the job specification. So ultimately, on the surface level, the company doesn't particularly look neuro-inclusive and doesn't really promote anything they're doing around neuro-inclusion. What that probably does a lot of the time is it means no disclosure at job offer, right? So because you haven't disclosed during the application and interview process, when you do get a job offer, then it's unlikely you'll disclose at this point. Now, there's a risk versus reward process, of course, and some people do disclose at this point because you're obviously protected by the Equality Act and the Employment Rights Act. But ultimately, a lot of the time, the neurodivergent employee will start a role with no adjustments in place. So you're already starting on the back foot a little bit here, right, where you haven't felt comfortable to disclose. And what we have there is a knock-on effect to where you're starting your role and you're masking from day one. What also happens then, and I've seen this a lot with our community, and when we operated more akin to a recruitment agency, I used to see this on a lot of CVs, is that the performance is actually not bad for about 3 to 6 months, because the employee will mask, of course. There's no adjustments in place, but the employee will self-adjust. But what you'll find is there'll be a few cracks appearing, right? Because masking is exhausting. It really is. And also there's a few things in there in terms of adjustments that you probably want to ask for, but you still don't feel comfortable to do so because the environment, again, you're working in is not particularly neuro-inclusive. The manager may notice a few traits, but at this point, performance isn't an issue. But what will happen eventually, and a lot of the time, is that because you haven't felt comfortable to disclose, is that it's likely the masking will take its toll. You don't feel particularly comfortable to disclose still, and then performance and energy levels start to slip, and the manager identifies underperformance. So the underperformance at this stage, it's really important to say, is not in any way, most of the time, associated with the skill level or the ability of the employee. It's because they just do not have a platform to show these skills. And the reason they don't have a platform to show these skills is because they haven't felt comfortable to disclose, right? And that responsibility, in my opinion, is on the employer. What the manager will then do and based on their knowledge is, I suppose, base all of their decision around the outputs, right, or the work they're seeing, without really understanding anything about neurodiversity. I suppose the only benefit of the doubt you can give someone at this point is that obviously they don't know the employee's neurodivergent a lot of the time. But I would suggest that this is almost a knock-on effect of a lack of neuro-inclusivity right at the start of the process. So we're getting into crisis point now, which is really a bit of a struggle. So then a few things can happen, right? At this point, sometimes the employee will disclose, at which point a lot of the time the manager will think, well, that's an excuse for underperformance, or the employee is dismissed and disclosure never comes up, and their neurotype is never discussed, or the employee just thinks, you know what, I'm going to leave. And we see this a lot of the time on CVs with quite short durations. But I would suggest that all of this could have been avoided if the employee was made to feel comfortable enough to disclose right at the start. So there's a lot going on here. And when we talk about this, if you do feel you can disclose at job application stage, and you do feel that you can disclose at job offer, if you ever get to a point where you are underperforming or struggling or maybe need some adjustments, because of the starting point where you have felt comfortable to disclose, you feel safe to ask for support, but also the manager feels comfortable in offering support. Right? So this domino effect of disclosure afterwards is key. And for me, is why it's so important. That's so important. Of course, it's optional. Of course, it's optional. And one day people won't need to disclose, right? We'll have universal design, but we are not at that stage yet with organizations. I really don't think we are. And so it's really important that if you feel comfortable to disclose, you're given the opportunity to do so. It's very clear, it's very concise, and you get all the support that you need. But most of all, you feel comfortable to have the conversation. And with that in mind, there's a few things to look at when you're considering what is a psychological safe environment, particularly if you start a role and you want to disclose afterwards. It really does start with organizations to make sure that you feel safe. And a few things that you can look at here is, the fact is, if the organization is talking openly about neurodiversity, right? If the conversations are happening around ADHD and autism and dyspraxia and dyscalculia and all of these things, well, they've got an employee resource group. All of the things we talk about in identifying neuro-inclusive companies, that's a good sign. When you've seen people disclose, or you go through your own process, you are believed, right? And that they are also curious, right? They want to ask questions. They want to know how to support. Again, that's quite a good telltale sign. Obviously, in this instance, you have to take the leap to disclose, but it might be that you almost soft disclose. You say, look, I'm struggling a little bit in this instance, and you ask for an adjustment without even disclosing. That can be a good way of testing that process. It's also good if your organization managers focus on strengths, but not unconditionally, right? They recognize that neurodivergent individuals do have a range of strengths that are very, very challenging to find with a lot of other neurotypical individuals, right? However, there is obviously a trade-off sometimes where you have to give a bit of support. You have to make sure there are adjustments in place and people have a platform. I won't even call it a trade-off. It's more of a balance, right, in terms of those adjustments and just trying to create a slightly different way of working to see an incredible level of productivity and innovation. But most importantly, look around and see if adjustments are being embraced, right? See if you see other people with noise cancelling headphones, or with slight flexibility in terms of their working practices, or memory software, or whatever it is, right? Just have a look around. And all of this will paint a picture as to whether you feel safe to disclose. Of course, at interview stage, or job application stage rather, there's a different level of sort of information to look at. But look, check out our Identifying Neuro-Inclusive Companies webinars and podcast. Really good. And then probably I'd say our key sort of I'd say a key pieces of information, right? They're really, really good. And I think they will help you make that decision as to whether you disclose or not. So thank you so much for watching or listening today. Hopefully you can see why we're so passionate around our community having the opportunity and the safety to disclose. We'll add this to the webinar collection where you can comment and ask questions. We always have the live webinar discussion on the Wednesday after this webinar goes out, and this normally goes out on a Monday. So if it's coming up to 6 p.m. on a Wednesday and you've watched this webinar, we'll probably be talking about this one. You can use the direct messaging service if you have a situation you'd like advice on. And it could be that you're thinking of disclosing, you're not quite sure if you're sort of balancing all the information. Throw the question out to us as a DM, or put it on the general chat. Got a very supportive community that will normally have some great ideas. So thank you so much for watching or listening today. If you are listening to this on Spotify or any of your podcast platforms, or watching us on YouTube, please see the link to join Diversita Connect in the comments or in the bios, or wherever the information is. It's free to join. Free to stay as a member. We have a donation model, but it's entirely optional, and we don't want that to be a barrier. But we've got so many great resources on there, and we're really building a nice community on there. Of course, please be patient with the platform. It's developing all the time, but there's a lot of well-meaning there, and there's some really great content. So thank you so much again for joining me today. Hopefully it's been useful, and look forward to seeing you on the next piece of information. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, share and subscribe. And scan the QR code to join the Diversita Connect community.